What up, Javaris? What's going on, good people? Wow. Ify, hold on. Let me type this and I'm like, yep. Survey. That's a bit easier way to do this. COVID. Black. And queer. Boom. 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 What up?
What up, what up, what up?
Listen, Linda. It's been a long 2 weeks. What's
Oh,
that shirt say, African?
I mean, no dashes, no
We
question.
represented for our tribes. I got on this shirt that says.
I mean, I can get you one.
I mean, I don't want to get jumped though.
Why would you get jumped?
I'm just saying, some we do tribalism. So actually, let me ask you a question. Are you excited
Okay.
about? Are you excited about Yvonne Orgy's special, HBO special?
Super excited. I think folks, so Yvonne and I have a lot of just mutual friends in common. She's very close with a lot of my cousins. And a lot of her comedic style before she was on Insecure,
Gosh,
people would always tag me and be like, Ify, you have to see this. And I would watch it. And I had the same reaction that I did to Insecure, where like some things were funny, but then some things were like, who told you about that?
got
so
it.
so I think it's going to be great. I think it's great for first generation people to see themselves. Uh, I do obviously I believe that we're all African, and as we talk more about inclusivity, I think it's also great for people to understand what it means to be born, especially first generation or from the diaspora immigrating here, what the reality is, and in our culture, just similar to Black culture globally, there are a lot of things that are painful that we laugh about because that's the only way you can rationalize it. So
Yeah.
I'm happy for her. I'm happy for Black women in general to get
Period.
their coins. So
That and she looks good.
yeah.
She looks amazing. I'm here for the glow up. I still watch Amanda's special and laugh.
Amanda's special was amazing. Say
Oh yeah.
whatever you want about Amanda Seals. I've watched that thing at least
Don't
three
say it
times.
around me though, because that's my friend. So
I
keep it
think
to
she's
yourself.
great. Yeah, keep it to yourself. And hey, friend, hey Amanda. I mean, I don't know her personally, but her show is brilliant. That was a brilliant show. And I don't listen to Small Little Doses regularly, but for the people that do, they also say that that's a very like great insider into who she is.
Most
Um,
definitely. It's
and I've
super
seen I've
thoughtful and
seen clips
thoughtful.
on the reel, and I think she adds another layer.
Yeah.
In addition to the brilliance of Lonnie Love, who many people don't know is an engineer.
Yes. Yes.
So they're definitely a lot of brilliance on that show.
Yeah.
So
How are you? Before we get into more substantive things, how are you today? How's your spirit?
I will say I needed Jill Scott and Erica Badu more than people know. I'm playing her the jam that's actually not on titles list, the
Playlist.
Smile Today by Erica Badu. And I feel like there were some unexpected things that happened this week that it's just really good to have that playing. So
Yeah.
my spirit is content right now, but it's still really busy. Have a lot of work. How's your spirit?
I feel much better this week than I did this time last week. Even still having to write 2 statements about the murders of Black people,
Hmm.
in addition to all that we did last week around Brianna and our
Hmm.
brother Ahmad.
Yeah,
But after having launched our survey, which we'll get into
yeah.
a bit, and having been loved on by some of my tribe, right? Like I just think about us having celebrated April and laughed a little bit on Zoom last night. I still am tired
So
though.
dope.
Yeah, happy birthday,
Yeah,
April.
we partied with Oscar So White, April Bryan last night,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and that
No,
was
not
really,
Ryan
really good.
Ray.
I mean, April,
But
April
we
Rain.
talked about April
But
Ryan
shout
before
out,
because right, shout out to both the Aprils, right?
oh my gosh, yes,
Okay, wait. So I want to before we get into the work, are you caught up on Insecure since we started there?
I am. I believe Yvonne Orji is talking right now with Kendrick about the Molly Issa debacle,
Oh,
which I
okay.
am not getting into anymore with folks. I said what I said when I said it,
You did. You tweeted
and
about it in particular about the dynamic in the relationship. People should follow it. Yep, pick it up.
pick it up.
I will say this: I found myself wanting to know so much more about Kelly, Natasha's character. I think she is
Always.
brilliant. I think she's beautiful. I laugh my ass off whenever she's on the screen because she steals it. And I want to know more about her character and how she shows up and what's going on in her life,
In
other than the
general.
fact that she's sex positive and funny. I'm also really curious to learn more about how Tiffany is dealing with postpartum. And
Well,
I'm
I raised
hopeful.
that. I raised that with you. I we don't. I don't want to. I don't want to make the assumption that she is, but I think a lot of women have questioned whether or not that is an issue, and it'll be interesting to see if they actually explore it
You don't think
as an
even if they
issue.
don't name it as such that we can't call it that at this moment? Or
I
you
don't. I
really?
don't. I think because it's an actual diagnosis, I wouldn't want to do like
Oh,
I.
fair,
You wouldn't
fair,
want to do that
fair,
to a
fair, fair,
woman.
fair, fair, fair.
But that isn't to say that there isn't a general baseline of just feelings that women are allowed to feel when they're when I imagine that they're new to birthing
Yeah,
anything.
yeah. I
Um,
see my friend Letty's raising her hand. She got a new beautiful baby in addition to her children at home,
oh,
so she might be wanting to contribute
yeah,
as well. Okay, no, that makes
yeah.
sense to me.
Why
Okay.
did you raise insecure? Was there anything you wanted to raise before we go into this?
Well, I caught up on the show because, of course, people have been discussing it, and I've been generally meh
Yeah.
about this season. Um,
Really?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I will say, I think that the music is consistently dope.
Sure.
Shout out to Raphael Sadiq. Shout out to Lasky and Keisha. I
Hmm.
also appreciate the time capsule preservation of South LA. It is home, and my soul feels filled every time I watch it.
Yeah,
But I struggle with some of the dynamics, and I found myself
I get it.
laughing out loud, in particular when the son of the neighbor asks, "How old are you?" Because I keep asking, "How much space am I supposed to give to them?" Not actually having conversations or dealing with confrontation. And actually, before jumping on here, was on Zoom celebrating a friend's birthday with some friends that I've had since undergrad.
Hmm.
And Melanie, who was the youngest person on that Zoom, said, I haven't had a blow up like that with a friend since we were 14, right? And so part of me is trying to appreciate that not only is it cinema and that it's supposed to encourage us to talk like this in the way that we are, there are parts of it that I just struggle mightily with.
Got it.
That's it.
Got
That's
it.
it.
I think I will say in general, I think there are more relationships that are like that than people want to admit.
Yeah.
I also think that breakups for Black women not only have not been displayed, even from age 14, right? Like what happens on, like, dare I say it, the Cosby Show. Somebody has an issue with a girlfriend at school. We don't see the issue. They come home, they talk to Mama Claire, and everything is supposed to be about, like, you know yourself, you stand strong, blah blah blah. So we are told to stand strong even within relationships that are extremely intimate. And whereas, what are the white kids watching? 90210. Them
Oh,
motherfuckers
yeah.
is sleeping with they literally best friend's friend, and then the brother the next week, and then there will be a whole season about them getting back together as friends. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm saying that they've been able to see it. So,
Yeah, that's fair. And Wendy's saying that she just broke up with her best friend in her 30s. Wendy, we
oh,
just talked. I'm sorry. Also, congratulations. I don't know what you say to somebody when that happens.
if it makes you more whole, congratulations. But that doesn't mean you're not going to mourn actually missing somebody. We mourn people that hurt us. So you know what I mean? Like when it's somebody that actually at points you can remember the love, right? Then those things can be nostalgic. I hope that what happens is that people they start looking at the love that they had.
Yeah.
Because if we're gonna be honest, season one, episode one, they were kind of shitty with each other, right? So we need to see maybe they should do like a flashback. We need to see like when shit was good because right now it seems like things are about understandable like I this is just how I am when I show up in confrontation to not being upfront with each other about
What's going on?
partnerships
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
relationships, right? So it's weird. I think it's just weird the stuff that they choose to not be honest with each other about because it's like, then what's the point of a friend? But
Right.
whatever. I'm here with Bishop, my dog, right? Like some
Listen,
motherfucker that
and
doesn't
Whitney said that
speak
she's free,
English.
so I want to celebrate Whitney being free.
Hey,
Um,
Whitney.
right.
I love
I'm all
Whitney.
about being free,
Whitney
especially
Whitney
if
is one half of an amazing duo called Sustainable Brooklyn, and I'm so happy that Pink Cornrows is like just anytime we can. There's some people that are just like they're not clients, they're not just partners, they're like tribe, right? So Whitney is tribe. So yeah.
I love that. I love that. As my girl Kim just came in here. All right, and she went to college with about like 1 degree
Did
of
you wait?
separation
Did you go
amongst
to
all of us.
GW, Whitney?
That's what that means, because that's what she went.
Okay, so we're
Okay.
okay, great.
Oh, look, we
Um,
want to paddle together. Look at God.
oh,
See,
look
I
at
wish we could
that.
tap in other people. Instagram needs to step up the technology so you can tap people in like house party,
Woo
but with more
woo! I went
discretion
to
because that's
GW
still weird.
Law, so we
Look,
are
small world.
alum. Look at this
Okay, so let's stay
circle.
in this space and talk about pink cornrows. You mentioned the name pink cornrows. There are some people I imagine who might not know about pink cornrows, but hopefully
Ah,
people saw. If you're following me or Ify this week, you saw that on Tuesday morning we launched a new survey instrument. I want to be clear that we're building on a foundation that was established by Pink Cornrows and Black Policy Lab, but the goal in launching COVID While Black and Queer was to collect data to be really inclusive about stories that haven't been told. And so before we talk about the new survey,
yeah.
if you tell people about Pink Cornrows and the foundation that was established with COVID While Black.
Yeah, thank you for that. So very quickly, Pink Cornrows actually has existed since December 2019. We're really quiet about how we launched, and we can have a whole separate discussion just about that. But I will say that one of the things that we were working on was being literally intentional from the beginning to how we roll out things, which is also pushing back against this desire to be extremely loud, for lack of a better word, when a new thing comes on the scene. A lot of the work that we do is in the what people would call diversity and inclusion space. We don't call it that. We believe that first of all, diversity and inclusion without equity is trash. So when we do talk about it, it's always equity, diversity, and inclusion, but we actually call it equity, leadership, and culture, because the culture piece of who we are tends to be left out of pretty much every policy consideration or strategy, whether it's in the workforce or in politics. So we are gambling on entering spaces 100% as we are, and not sugarcoating how we do our approach. And part of the way we do that, because bias is a very strong hell of a drug, is we called ourselves something that if you don't want to fuck with us, then don't fuck with us. But we're called Pink Cornrows. And therefore, you can be sure to get quality, disruption, change, growth, and truth. We really, ground ourselves in truth, which means facts, which means facts about those entities and people that we often choose to ignore, even within our own community. So fast forward to why COVID While Black and Queer was essential, and I thank you for reaching out to us and literally just reminding. It wasn't. I don't even think you had to push us. It was called COVID While Black because we're Black. But I will also say that in the first day, we got similar results to our first day when we put out COVID While Black, which is to say we had 200, just shy of 200 surveys yesterday in the first, less than 24 hours with the COVID While Black and Queer. So what is also great about our space is that we don't come into spaces thinking that we know everything. We want to make sure that we're collaborating to intensify inclusivity and challenge how we get really just the information we need to ensure that we are addressing our community with the right software, with the right hardware, with the right people. But also, as you know, with the survey, it also asks individuals to provide insight on solutions. And
Right.
we don't see, I mean, if we think about it, we still play the pimping of oppression game for communities, Black women, Black queer folk, essential workers. We want to put out the statistics. We want to say, look at them. We'll even put their picture up when it's, you know, Pride Month, Black History Month. But when it comes to actually saying, all right, you all are actually the most marginalized, so why don't you all draft the solution? Never happens.
Right.
And so, and you know this because we've worked in spaces where people that even look like us will invite us to the space, and we have to keep reminding folks. Remember that one time I was like, David's not in the room, but when he gets back, if I don't say that we need to protect the queer babies, I'll get fucked up, because that's the type of relationship that we have. And I told you when you came back in the room that nobody had raised it, and you, because I love seeing you go to fuck off. I let you go to fuck off, and I just, you know, drank my tea on the side. But
Well, so let's ground people in what we're talking about, right? So the Ify and I show up in a lot of spaces together, and are part of a number of advisory councils, and one in particular was around mental health and Black folks. So there was a number of folks in a variety of sectors who had gathered over time to talk about what more we could be doing to ensure that Black people, diverse Black communities, had access to high quality mental health.
yeah,
And I often make the point that it should not be required of people who show up with particular identity politics to have to represent for that community to be identified, served, acknowledged in any way, shape, or form. And in particular, I am bothered by the expectation that people aren't going to mention Black queer folks unless and until I'm in the room. And so part of this is, I think, us acknowledging and appreciating that the way we do diversity, inclusion, and equity work in real time is being mindful of these intersectional connections and gaps that exist, and otherwise leaning in to try and fill them. And so I want to say, I don't know if I said it already, but thank you for the partnership specifically around COVID While Black, because for me, the three things I keep saying to people are, one, there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that we know as well, right? We know based on all available data that Black communities, especially spaces where Black people are overly saturated, right? The South, a lot of small, rural, isolated communities, places where Black people have always lived, even when people haven't not acknowledged it. In those communities, we know that Black people are most impacted by COVID. We are testing for COVID at higher rates. We're dying from COVID at higher rates. But we also know that we should expect that those numbers are underreported, that they're undercounts. And we also know that our communities are not targeted for testing, and there's never been a history of democratized healthcare. And so the goal of collecting data to better understand how Black folks are experiencing COVID is novel and important. And in spite of the fact that people are on TV all day talking about how Black people are affected, nobody's really going deep with regard to the data.
right,
So that's one.
right.
The second thing, and this is for everybody watching now who has not yet taken the survey, I dropped the link I pinned the link rather, but it's bit.ly, COVID While Black. And again, I apologize, I'm in New York. Again, a reminder that we're living in a global pandemic. Things like that happen. But you don't have to be Black and queer to take the survey, right? The goal is to acknowledge the beautiful diversity that has always existed in our community, and to also appreciate that we don't yet have the kinds of data collection
Trying to
tools
get
or
the
the
David
safety
glow.
measures. Listen, I can't with you. That make it possible for us to have more meaningful conversations about Black queer people, right? And then the third thing is that, and this is your leadership, I've never seen a survey, at least a public health survey, that also asks people to
Hey,
identify needs that
Tyranny.
might not have been articulated, or to lift up the names of people that have been affected or have otherwise transitioned as a result of COVID. So just really want to encourage everybody who has not yet taken the survey to please take it. And after you take it, please share it with people in your network so that we can collect data and do a better job of telling these stories.
Awesome. Awesome. I don't have anything else to add. That was a perfect summation of
All right.
why we launched it. Another part that, and I think some folks, I think we talked after this had happened, but I also think it's really important for people to know that we built the survey um, inspired. There was a wave of individuals. In fact, I was talking to a friend earlier today from the city. I will not mention her name because that's just the code that we have. But the one thing that I had said to her in response to, there was some work that she was doing with primarily Black uh, public servants, people that work in government, but they could see data the way we could see data, like, yo, this thing is going to hit us hard, right? So they were doing this thing. We have this group called the Underground, and they were kind of just doing this thing, like just to kind of be like, yo, so what's up? And like, we're not going to wait for our bosses to approve for certain things to happen.
Right. We
And
just
I
gonna move.
literally, and I told her that that was the same feeling I had when I called some comrades that we had worked with in the UK, just to check on. Like, at first it started with a check in, and then the end it was like, yo, so rice,
Strategy.
the rice and peas, like,
Right.
tell me which rice and peas joint needs to get to what senior center. And I literally said to her, when COVID hit, niggas got the calling, right? And we both just started laughing, because the reality is, if you wasn't sharing tips on which, shout out to Wakenya Clanton, who told me which Dollar General to go to in my hood, and was like, girl, don't mess with them people at Target. You better take your ass over to the dollar. The dollar store was good for us as kids. It's good for us now. And that's where I got my rubbing alcohol, 70% proof, because if it's less than 70, it ain't shit. And
Right.
like, down to my Oreo Thin Mints, like, it was one of those things where strategy was the juice of us is, and I know some people call it struggle. I don't call it struggle. I call it strategy, right? Like, we see some shit, and we already recognize that through bias and racism, that those who are in power, when they don't have answers, they build fear. And so we saw that the fear that was brewing around what they were at that time calling the Wuhan virus didn't
Yeah.
make sense. We live in New York City, people travel. So we were like, not, first of all, we have the largest like, we have a significant Asian American population. So
Right.
there's a way to talk about this without any bias, to protect not only the individuals that live within their community, but also the surrounding areas, and for it to be done in a mutually beneficial way that also dignifies people and also dignifies life. And I think that's what's been the hardest, is this lack of dignity for life. But that's what happens when you don't have culture. So I just want to state that this is not just here, but there's a global conversation that the diaspora is having. And if anybody's following this, because like, every day I check on different data points across different demographics, Brazil is about to be the next New York City. And that concerns me, because
Already though, right? Isn't Brazil the
it's
space in
already
particular where we've been most concerned because of how little data has been reported?
correct. And if, for those that are aware of their leadership is even more now
Trash.
Trump-esque. So I say all that to say that I don't want people to uh, opportunities like a survey aren't small, number one, but I also want people to provide the insight that David gave and not be dissuaded when they see a survey. We'll talk offline about the questions people had about me. Like, girl, oh, I didn't know you were queer. I was like, I'm not, but it wouldn't matter. And
Which is interesting, right?
but that is the question. I did not even think about it when it went out. But then I was just like, I didn't even know that would be the concern. But I was like, but it's also not a concern. Like, share the goddamn survey. Like, we need the information. But I do think that people should give it. The reality is, we have to give those caveats, and you have to say you do not have to be queer to fill out this survey.
Right.
But I do think moving forward, hopefully this provides an introspective conversation within Blackness about what our survival is and what it means when we can put out a survey and get basically at this point almost 1/5 or if not more of our respondents coming from communities that when we sent it out initially did not feel like they were included. That matters to me.
Yeah.
And so I just want to thank you for pushing us for that intentionality. And obviously we will continue to find other ways for intersection to pop up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I live for the day where it doesn't, again, require people having to identify, be intimately affected by an issue to otherwise champion it. And it is serendipitous that as you were talking about that, our sister Rebecca Coakley slid in to the chat, right? And so
Hey, Becca.
what I thought about, hey, Becca, tell the baby we said hey. And what I thought about as you shared that story is that when Ahmaud Arbery, when we learned about Ahmaud Arbery having been murdered 10 weeks after the fact, I issued a statement on behalf of NBJC, and I got a call from no less than 3 reporters who all asked me, was Ahmaud gay? It shook me, right? In particular because it reminded me that while I know for a fact that I cannot tease apart the intimate parts of what makes me whole, the world still very much sees us in one-dimensional ways. And there is this expectation that I now as to some people, I think a Black queer leader, and they smush those words together, not necessarily with a hyphen, should not be talking about things publicly unless there's an explicit queer angle, right? And that is even not to acknowledge how complicated it is for us to invite people in, the reality that so many people engage in queer relationships without ever having to identify or check a box or give a public declaration of having that experience. And again, this reflexive desire that we have, I think, to know information about people that we otherwise should not feel entitled to have access to, right? If I invite you in because you've done the work to demonstrate that you care and are concerned and are compassionate, that's one thing. But this, I think, this reflexive habit of when people see you do something that is supportive of queer people or people with disabilities, it's almost like they're intuiting that as a disclosure and now feel like, oh, let's talk about the thing that you otherwise didn't tell me about, but I might have been thinking about on the low.
Well, I think we have to remember, first of all, there was an eerily similar case in what happened with Trayvon Martin, right? Months later, it being seen as an issue and people not knowing that several weeks had passed, months had passed before there was attention. That, you know, it is not uncommon that the usage of behavior, the usage of prior, quote unquote, prior records and orientation, that any of those things that are suspicious, and we will get into the segment that I really want to focus on, which are the women that have been.
Let's do it now.
Have been ignored. But I just want to. I say that intentionally because part of the reason why we know that Nina Pop was not only, you know, acknowledged for transitioning, but also revered in the same way that we would do, you know, Black male life. That has everything to do with Nina Pop living in this world as Nina Pop, right? And so, but even when I think of Breonna Taylor and I think about, you know, Tiffany Mofield, who, you know, died in a New Jersey prison, I think about each one of them. You could sit and I could sit and honestly sit with civil rights leaders that would literally, if they were honest, say, well, this person, or the reason why some of my members may not stand for this person is because of X, Y, and Z. And unfortunately, and you know, you and I have had this conversation. We've also been, you know, feel differently at points about what collaboration looks like, because it feels very raw to continue building in civil rights spaces that still can't acknowledge that all Black lives matter. Right. It is very frustrating because as much as people like you and so many other people stand up in those spaces and end up being the voice, I also don't think that there should just, this is just my opinion, that one person that they like should be the one that holds all of humanity in that space. And like you said earlier, if you're not in that space, these people's lives don't get uplifted.
Yeah.
So it's been a very hard week, I think, for Black women, and intentionally thinking of women in the spelling of WOMXN, that
Yeah.
we continue to
You
have
make it
to
sound
urge
like a
people.
goddamn housewife.
Well, first of all, don't say housewife. It could be house
I
husband.
mean, like,
Don't
actually, like, with
fucking
all the
do that.
housewives
Don't do
reunions. I
that.
mean,
No,
like, with all
don't
the
do that.
reunions.
Don't fucking do that. But no, I think that I am frustrated,
Yeah.
and have been in this space, and have also held, I think, both of these spaces in ways that tears me inside, which is also part of the reason why it's like, okay, so since neither side is moving, we might as well just show up as we are. I intentionally wore this shirt that says African because no matter who we're talking about, this is actually our original origin. And therefore, the mindset allows us to at least struggle a little bit with, what does tribe look like? What does protection look like? What does safety look like outside of this experiment called America? That does not mean that I don't love or acknowledge the fact that I'm connected to this land. I was born here. Shout out to Trenton, New Jersey. And it doesn't mean that we all don't have hoods and reps and whatever. It does mean that this is not our original way of thinking.
Yeah.
And that psyche is fucking us up.
So
And
let's.
I think very quickly, I think with coalition building, I am continually going to urge that for anyone who put a hashtag in front of Sean or Ahmad's
Ahmad,
name or Rand,
Trayvon.
think about Tiffany, who I think it's disgusting, not only was infected with COVID, but from what I understand, died in a shower, was locked in a shower in a New Jersey jail facility, and died there. And what that means for the other witnesses to see a woman die in a facility that they were all locked in. Like, we have to reenact those stories, so that we don't get desensitized to the fact that we are literally still being erased and then asked to do the work and whipped in the process of doing the work, right?
So you covered Tiffany Mofield, who died April 29th in solitary confinement in a New Jersey prison. You mentioned Nina Pop, who broke me in part because still people aren't talking about it. A Black trans woman who was murdered in her home. No one has been arrested. There has been no form of justice rendered in her particular case, and Nina also joins a community of Black trans women who every year are murdered, often in silence. And then you mentioned as well our sister Brianna, who many people were introduced to over the last week, but who more than a month ago was murdered in her home at 1 a.m. in the morning when the police department in Kentucky botched the delivery of a drug warrant for someone that we now have learned was already in custody. And there are two things that I just want to highlight before asking you to talk really more, Ify, about how we make sense of the deafening silence when Black women and girls are victims. One, Tiffany's boyfriend is a registered gun owner who had a gun, and when they thought someone was in their home who shouldn't have been in their home, which was the case even though the police had a quote warrant, used his gun. And the police are now using that as justification for firing more than 20 rounds at a minimum into and at her house, including rounds that hit her neighbor's home, where her neighbor had a young child under 5 years of age home. And so, you know, how it is that laws established to protect people and their rights, specifically white people and their rights and their property, are now being used to, again, justify the murder of Black people is something that I'm really interested in your thoughts around. And then the second piece is what you mentioned earlier, which is this reflexive habit of Black people being tried for their own murder, right? So this came up for me yesterday when Ben Crump was talking first about Ahmaud Arbery and the character assassination around whether or not he was a criminal, and this idea that he was a burglar. And what I said was, even in the middle of the attempt to rationalize him maybe being a burglar, is that so fucking what, right? Like, even if he did burglarize something, the penalty for that might be arrest, it might be a fine. It definitely is not death without a trial, right?
Right.
Similarly, with regard to Breonna, what people are rallying behind is that she was an EMT, she was a frontline service worker, she was somebody who sacrificed, she was a good Black woman. And the thing that I struggle most with in these moments, my aunt asked a question earlier, is why does it matter if Ahmaud was gay? It doesn't, it shouldn't. However, it feels like in America, unless you live a perfect life, unless you, nobody can ever produce a picture of you smoking weed or flicking off somebody or doing any of the things that otherwise don't fall into the category of politics or respectability, when you are murdered, it is your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, I'm saying all of that to, one, identify that as a Black man, as a Black male feminist. It bothers me that too often people will run for Black men and boys, but won't even say the name of Black women and girls. And how do we make sense of that? What do we do as a result of it?
I'm gonna treat this like it's my first day of my class. As you know, I teach a course called African Americans and the Law.
Teach the babies.
What I love about that class is, and some of you all may have heard this before, but people often think that what Black people, and especially what Black women go through, and what Black queer folk go through, is emotional. It is not emotional, our existence. Our existence is legal. And as a Black woman, our existence is legal at least twofold, right? And the more identities you add on that, there you go. But I say this specifically for the fact that we haven't grappled with is that since the beginning of time, Black girls who become women have always had their own history. We just don't tell it. So even the way we tell history about slavery and the civil rights movement, it is a generalized, Black people marched, Black people did this, Black people did that. What the fuck are you talking about? There was a labor largely led by Bayard Rustin, a feminist who recognized that his engineering was working with other forgotten individuals behind the scenes to ensure that this wonderful display that people saw. Do you know how many sandwiches they made? Do you know how many shoes they had to go through? Do you know how many nurses were at stations?
Transportation had to be arranged.
Extremely women-led movement, as most movements are. So I say that intentionally to say that history is built on narratives. Narratives are chosen by people in power. And even in the space that we have, Black men with the power of the 15th Amendment have always had a longer history of being at least a little closer to human than Black women. And that is something that we have to was going, but that is something that we not only have to understand. That is something that I
can hear you. You were saying closer to. Can you go back? Can you go back? If you were saying that allows you to get closer to human. Say more about that.
What I'm saying is that by us acknowledging that, it allows us to get us closer to humanity, and not the humanity of sameness, but the humanity of realness, right? So there are certain protections. Pink cornrows is created because pink, obviously it's not about pink is for girls and blue. We don't necessarily believe in that way. It is that the normalcy in this nation and in most societies is that pink is the symbol of femininity. Right. Pink is the symbol of protection. And what Black women have never been afforded is protection. In fact, we say Black women so much, we forget that they started off as Black girls. So most Black women don't even have girlhood. So when you look at what Breonna Taylor has gone through, look at what Nina Pop has gone through, look at what Tiffany Mofield has gone through, our minds can't help but to ask questions about what type of woman was she, because that then justifies how much sympathy or empathy we give towards her.
And response, yeah.
Right? And to be clear, even with Breonna, if you remember when it first came out, everybody was starting to talk about her boyfriend, because even if she was great, somebody she's connected to has to be
trash.
Because Black women don't know how to pick mates, which is a whole nother conversation. But that is the stigma that we are given in this society. So I will say that is the way I make sense of it, is that if we don't start with truth, then what ends up happening is we move with well intentions the way white people move with well intentions, and I don't believe good intent. If we have a saying that says the road to hell is paved in good
Good
intentions, I don't know
intention.
why the fuck we trust good intentions, but we do it in our own community, and that also means we trust extremely influential, but haven't had to prove equity other than the fact that their skin color is black, leaders in the spaces and the places that we still give our money to and are still called on by mostly white liberal spaces. We give them the freedom to talk about black people in a generalized way in fucking 2020. Like, we have to demand more for us to be protected. And you know, I stick on this data point that this epidemic is a woman's epidemic as much as it's a black person's epidemic. More black women, more black and brown women are essential workers in
Yeah.
the class of individuals that we didn't give a fuck about until there's an epidemic, which means they have to put their bodies on the line for us to get food. 9 out of 10 nurses are women. Majority of them are women of color. We don't say these things because we don't get because then it would cause a different response. Juxtapose that with 9/11. 9/11, the response was not just about these are frontline workers. The response was our firefighters and
Yeah.
our police, which
Yeah.
even if if your wife, if your partner was a firefighter or police, those are genderized positions that automatically evoke maleness. The bills were
White
being
maleness.
written immediately for the seen and unforeseen illnesses that would come from that. We still have nurses asking for PPE.
Right.
So this is what I'm saying, is that we have fights right now, and I'm not saying that the hashtags don't matter. I had the hashtags. I believe in all of it matters. If you can march, march. If you can't march, roll. If you can't roll, hashtag. I believe in all of those things. And I also find it very problematic that on a basic level, we have not been able to say all Black lives matter. And anytime a Black life is taken prematurely, I don't give a fuck. I don't even care if that person drew out a gun, you would still have to prove that it wasn't self-defense. You would still have to prove that they weren't standing their own fucking ground. You would still have to prove that they weren't using the castle doctrine. We are allowed to have guns. We are allowed to protect ourselves. It may not be safe to, but we are allowed to. So this shaming that we have of maleness, because that is largely what's done to those that are perceived and identify as male, needs to be recognized. And then with women and girls, we have to start acknowledging that the erasure is also going to hinder how, especially with this epidemic, we receive reparations
Yeah.
for our labor. You see what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah, I
So
definitely do. I follow
I
all of
just
that.
feel like a lot of the spaces that you're in, to be very honest with you, could benefit with broadening that discussion, because they do have the privilege of speaking to not just policymakers, which we both have access to, but people in the media who are, honestly, they're just not a part of our community. So they are relying on different people to be our mouthpieces. So this is really dangerous, I
Yeah, no,
think.
I think that's right. And I'm thinking much about, we talked about her before, but my partner in good, Dr. Lauren C. Mims, and the work that she's doing around Black women and girls. I also love the language that you offered, acknowledging that there's power and precision around girls who grow into womanhood, because too often, again, our babies aren't allowed to be babies. It's one of the reasons why I use the phrase teach the babies. So let me ask this in terms of call to actions. I actually, Libby, I'll name something. It bothers me to follow suit that we still don't have an active coordinated attempt to pass hate crimes legislation that would ban lynching, including throughout the South. One of the first people in our chat was our brother Javaris. And I mentioned to Ben yesterday that we should be pushing Trayvon's law in all of the states where it's not yet on the books. June 26th is a date when the Georgia State Legislature goes back into session, and we should be applying pressure there. In the case of Nina, in the case of Brianna, and I'm not as intimately familiar with the details of the case of Tiffany, but there are also opportunities for us to push the police department, the DA, and state attorneys to be active in ways that they're otherwise responsible for. What do you want people to be doing, both as a direct response to what has happened to these three sisters, but also more generally to the silence that we are often met with when Black women and girls need us most?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, people have to share their stories, right? Nothing happens without awareness. So I think that for those that are watching, for those that saw people that were on here and then they left. Please share their stories. Again, it's Tiffany Mofield, it's Brianna Taylor, it's Nina Pop. Please just find, if you hashtag any of their names on Twitter right now, or probably on Instagram, you can find their stories and just reshare it. I don't think it takes anything to share. I also think that people strategically don't share. And I live in a world where, like, if you see it, I'm a person of faith, right? So there's this concept that, like, once you know something, you're responsible for it. So people just need to be responsible for the information that they have. So that's number one. Number two, join, if you haven't, I shared it on my wall. CJ Action Fund is pushing forward a call to action to finally fight against stand your ground laws. What people may not know is that I worked on pushing, you may remember, I worked on pushing for Trayvon Martin's murder to be seen as a lynching. And I actually got to, because it was, and it was under the Matthew Shepard bill,
James Byrd,
but it was all
bill.
Correct, and people didn't know about James Byrd, and again, that's another form of erasure, right? We are so used to seeing Black bodies killed that we don't see it as a hate crime. I don't give a fuck who's on the other side of, as far as being seen as the perpetrator. And so that was actually the first Stand Your Ground hearing on the House Hill, as you know. Not too shortly, unfortunately, after that, now Congresswoman Lucy McBath held the first Stand Your Ground hearing on the Senate side. And people just need to be more informed about these laws. And it's time for us to erase those laws off the books. We already have self-defense. If people feel that, if they feel that confident in the law, they should just use the laws that we have. And there's no need for Stand Your Ground. So, and finally, I would just say the reason why I mentioned CJ Action Fund, we know that there are a lot of gun rights groups out there, but to be honest with you, they're not fighting for Black lives. And shout out to Amber Goodwin and a lot of the group individuals that are leading that effort. We need to do our best to follow and sharpen within Black spaces. And that comes with its own, we have our own baggage of what that means with working with each other. And we have our own issues as to how we've been conditioned to see white as right. But I really challenge myself every day that when I see an action from people that look like me, I am going to uplift that action. So I think that that's actually where we start. These policies, I mean, I have my own feelings about DAs and police. We're going through a real police crisis here in New York City that nobody is even wants to touch on, because the reality is, between the police unions and the fact that we're actually dealing with a paramilitary state, you know, tread lightly. If you feel like you can do something, do something. But I think that there's something, again, about starting in the village first and identify who's in the village. And if you can't even, if you can only raise one half of your community because that's what feels comfortable, you've literally just kept us open and susceptible to just non-wholeness. And I hope wholeness is the goal.
Yeah, thrival, to use your word, thrival.
That's my word, thrival.
I want to, before I raise something that Whitney wrote in the comments, you mentioned the Castle Doctrine. For folks who are unfamiliar, say a little bit more about that and application.
Castle Doctrine is basically that you have the right to protect your house. That's it. That's all. It's castle because it's Old English law, right? So people were protecting their castles. But it's technically, but if we think about the community members that were killed in their own home, killed in their own backyards, you now recognize how much, even more from a legal perspective, how egregious it was that young brothers and young sisters, babies, Ayanna, right, killed in her bed in her grandmother's home. They don't care about the thing that they said is supposed to protect us. Yes, thank you for raising Fred Hampton, right? Fred Hampton, whose wife was pregnant at the time, right? Again, because there's a fuller story of it's not just Fred Hampton, it's also his wife who was pregnant with their child, right? And so I just feel like stories matter, man. Like narratives are so important, because when you start putting the pieces together, the shit's not emotional. The shit is logical, and it continues to repeat itself. So we have to find different ways to kind of tell that story, and learn from those lessons. But yeah, sure, I think all of those actions you've raised could be done. I do think that I would love to see, I'm just going to be very honest. There are a lot of women behind the scenes, and a few queer folk that are also working on these issues behind the scenes. I would love to see more of them get the mic to talk about these issues. I do think we lose a lot when we look at the deity of the civil rights icon model, which is still what we hold in the Black community, of mostly Black male voices that are
Black
talking
male,
about
Black seemingly cis, hetero presenting male, able-bodied male, Christian male. Yeah. No, we
I
have
love
much more
them.
to
I
do in
love
that
them,
regard.
you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We have 9 minutes left. I wonder if you
Sure.
have comments, because I didn't see Fred Hampton. I know Whitney was talking about the negotiation of respectability politics as possibly a coping mechanism, something that we do to help us make sense of being where we are now. I want to ask you, Ify, I've been doing a lot of rereading of Derek Bell and critical race theory.
Yeah.
This came up in the conversation I had with our sister Feminista Jones, Michelle Taylor.
Hmm.
One, I want to know your thoughts on Derek Bell's racial radicalism principle, right? This idea that we should let go of the idea that we're ever going to be equal and dream anew from there.
Hmm.
This sort of, how are you thinking about
Hmm.
us moving through the place that we're in now and
Well,
thriving on the other side of COVID?
well, I don't have too many opinions about Derek Bell. I'm gonna tell you the falseness about equality is, number one, we've been sold that equality is the goal. Hell, even Martin Luther King was sold that equality was the goal, but Thurgood Marshall made it clear that equity is the goal, right? So equality is a lie. Equality, sorry, I said that. That sucks. If
Why
I
are you
had,
sorry?
because I train in this area, so but equality
Tell the
is a
truth.
equality is a farce. But I'm also telling you why equality doesn't do us a service, and I'm definitely going to speak as a Black woman who is multi-potentialite, and does a lot with a little. When you start talking to me about equality, that means that I'm not able to be my full self. Black people should not be forced to be equal because the standard is still whiteness. It's not humanity. So equality has a barometer issue. And until we define humanity, which I still think we would need to have a forum, we would need to have an actual goddamn conference of what is humanity. Because as of right now, whiteness is still seen as the standard. So I would not want whiteness to tell me that they are now accepting of me and therefore we are equal. We would actually have to redefine as a global phenomenon what it means to be human. And I know for my students, they go through the process. I think I've told you this. The whole semester is built on not do Black Lives Matter, but are Black Lives human? And we use the law to have them trace and make the argument that our lives are human or not. And what about a good percentage of them realizes that we're not treated as human, but white people are not human, and not and it's because they also have not been taught humanity, right? That there's been an inherited almost like beast like of power
Yeah.
that forces them to normalize, because they have the power to normalize, that they are humane, and therefore we have then used data to say we are, first of all, these gaps that we keep sharing, half of them motherfuckers are okay with it because they don't do shit about it. And that's what people need to recognize. I don't have a problem with the people that got the flags and are out in the street. I have a problem with the people that see the shit and don't do nothing about it, right? Which is the majority of white people. So yeah, I agree that equality is not a real goal, but I think that a feminist lens would say that equality is not the real goal, largely because what Black women, especially as an over degreed, underworked, and even without degrees, overworked community, what is equal, right? We still trying to survive. We just want to be left alone,
At a minimum, yeah.
at a minimum. And so, and we don't want to be the ones that come in to keep the entire fucking nation alive, right? And only memorialized when we die. So
If we're lucky, I even
if
took,
somebody even knows your name.
yeah, we use the term essential worker now, and I even think that's problematic, right? A lot of folks, this is probably where we should have began, or just the way that things happen, because people are going off now saying this is right. Will said equality is a lie, set to low bar. I even think about the use of the term essential worker is problematic because they're not necessarily essential. Many of them weren't afforded the protections that they should have had before the crisis. They don't have access, as you mentioned, to the basic supports that they need now so that they're not testing positive or otherwise facing additional crises as a result of them showing up and doing things that are required for privileged people to bitch about their privilege.
But they're also not essential now. So they're essential because we say they're essential. Like it's again, bringing it down to the simplistic, the way the society uses words.
Yeah, words matter.
Right? Like it's like Gladiator, right? Gladiator is one of my favorite movies. If you were selected to enter into the Coliseum, that was seen as a rite of passage. But nigga, I'm gonna die, right? So what the fuck? Like, what the fuck does your title mean to me? And
yeah, Whitney said it's not essential; they're expendable. That's what we should be calling them, expendable workers.
Expendable and indentured in many ways, right? Like this is what we have is a form of servitude that always existed. And again, I think that if we're going to me, the case that we're building anyway, and hopefully people will stay engaged with COVID While Black when we do this virtual series, is really looking at how we treated 9/11. It is really crucial that we look at how we treated those that we called essential then and the frontline workers compared to now.
That and to go back to this point, this is also why we created BlackBrilliance, right? To shine this light, to give a platform to folks, Black women, Black femmes, queer folks. So if you are doing that work and we can tap in, please connect them. But a sister, Dr. Janina, who runs In Those Genes, the podcast, she's a geneticist. She reminded me when we had a conversation about COVID that yellow fever in Philadelphia is a lesson for us in this regard too, right? It was so the case that as white people, white privileged people were dying as a result of yellow fever, they convinced using language, Black people, that we were immune to yellow fever and convinced us to stay and take care of white people as they were dying. And then what happens, of course, we die and we are left without any form of reparations to be made whole for showing up to take care of white people in the way that we do. And so again, right, Becca said like that this is also just like underlying condition versus pre-existing condition. One sounds shady, the other sounds blameless. So much of this is about us appreciating that words matter, and we got to call a thing, as Aniana was saying.
And we still don't call the ultimate pre-existing condition of racism, right? So even we could talk about my health as this society wants us to talk about what we go through in an individual way. This is a culture issue, right? So it's one thing for me to have a disability, which I do. It's another thing for me to have a disability in a village that gives a fuck about me. And it's another thing for me to have a disability in a space that doesn't even see me. And then there's another thing to be in a space where they try to kill me. So we're also not talking about that there are things happening behind closed doors in these nursing homes, in these spaces where people are making decisions as to who's going to get the ventilator or not. There are women who are right now, Black pregnant women who are still facing discrimination when they go to these hospitals that nobody's even talking about right now, that are, unfortunately, there are a lot of women who have passed and their babies just barely made it. Like, I just want us to recognize that the pre-existing condition, we cannot let America run away that racialized capitalism, because that's why essential workers are essential, because they're still bringing in revenue. That racialized capitalism is always the pre-existing condition that we can never, ever, ever let America forget about itself, ever. At least not with this African.
I think that's right. I love that. Ify, let's do this. We got a minute left. Tell people where you got your sweater. I want people to stay tuned to BlackBrilliance. If you haven't already, please take the COVID While Black and Queer survey. Tell people where you got your sweater. Lift up again, say the names of our sisters, and then we're just going to let the time run out as people think about them and their lives and their legacy.
I think I got this sweater. The tag here says OK Africa. So I think you can get it on OK Africa. I got it from one of these shops out here in Brooklyn. And then the women, Tiffany Mofield, Breonna Taylor, Nina Pop. And just keep your eyes open, because I'm sure there are other women dying that we don't know about. But we continue to lift up Sean and Ahmaud, because we have to stay on top of those cases as well. That's all I got.
She just came to me in this moment.
That's right, SayHerName.
I want to also lift up our sister, Chiquisha Clemens, who is still struggling and suffering an injustice that she didn't deserve.
Hey, Chiquisha, our sister. Yeah.
I love you, sis. We'll talk soon.
Love you too. Bye.